The series of events that led to my travels in Mexico began in the winter of 1973 in Princeton, New Jersey. I was renting a room from a couple who were friends of mine for $50 a month. I had by that time enjoyed 3 solid years of adventures and travel since finishing high school in 1970. Late one evening in December of 1973, I was hanging around downtown Princeton and met up with a couple friends who were with a young lady named Maria, who was a few years younger than me. Over the course of the evening, I was struck by Maria's inner peace and natural beauty. She radiated a sense of calmness and well-being, and I felt very comfortable in her presence. A few days later, just before the Christmas holidays, Maria and I had met up again, and we decided to go out drinking while wandering around downtown Princeton. Neither of us were into the bar scene, so we purchased some wine at a local liquor store and walked around the small downtown area while slowly draining the bottle. We ended up getting caught in a rainstorm, and within minutes we were both drenched. We needed to go somewhere to dry out. Maria suggested that we go to the farm. I thought that was kind of weird. Why was it called the farm and not our farm or my dad's farm? She said that she lived there with her stepmom, dad, and 8 siblings. As she began to relate tidbits about life on the farm, I was intrigued. She said that their home and property were called Alpha Farm. So Maria and I hopped in my car and headed towards Alpha Farm, which was located in the heavily wooded hills above Ringo's, NJ, approximately 15 miles northwest of Princeton in the Sauerland Mountains. After driving down numerous isolated country roads while heading deeper into the hills, we eventually reached an unpaved driveway that was approximately half a mile long and wound its way to the top of a distant hill. Approximately a third of the way up the driveway was a residence occupied by her family's only neighbor. I later heard that on occasion the neighbor would fire a machine gun on his property. Vague references were made about a mafia connection. As we reached the end of the driveway, I saw 2 cabins and a large 1-story house that was made up of 2 long perpendicular sections in the shape of a carpenter's angle, like the letter L, but both parts of the L were equal in length. I could see what appeared to be a sheep pen, a couple of corralled horses, and sitting on the right side of the driveway was a large 1,000-gallon gas tank. The country was going through a period of gas rationing. Maria's father, Nathaniel, had apparently purchased the large tank and installed it on his property so that he would have easy access to gasoline when needed. He must have had good connections because a couple times a year, a large fuel truck would drive to his property and fill the tank with gasoline. Maria's father, Nathaniel, had apparently purchased the large tank and installed it. I stopped at a widened area of the driveway where numerous other vehicles were haphazardly parked. We appeared to be close to the summit of the large hill, with the uphill side forested and the downhill side cleared. The lights from the valley could be seen twinkling in the distance. We entered through the front entrance and passed through a hallway to the living room, which was quite large and was located where the 2 lengths of the house met. There were approximately 15 to 20 people in the room. Apparently, Maria's family was holding a Christmas party for their friends. Everyone was sitting in various chairs and sofas, as well as a swinging wooden couch that hung from ropes strung from the rafters. The couch was hung directly in front of a 10-foot-wide fireplace. The couch could be easily untied from the ropes and hung facing the fireplace or the living room. We entered the room, and Maria casually announced to the group in a soft voice that I was a friend of hers. As I looked around the room, everyone smiled. It was very casual. No name-sharing, shaking of hands, or standard greetings. The atmosphere was very relaxing. At that point, I had not formally met anyone. I grabbed one of the available seats and sat down facing the rest of the group. The seats were all arranged in a large oval shape so that everyone could see each other while making conversation and socializing. The group appeared to consist of Maria's numerous siblings, her parents, and approximately 10 other people who were friends of the family. Everyone had drinks, and the smell of cigarettes and marijuana permeated the room. Progressive rock music was playing in the background, and the lights in the room were soft and inviting, creating a warm and cozy visual and oral refuge. Everything seemed very relaxed and carefree, and I slowly began to recover from my night of drinking and getting drenched in the pouring rain. A short time later, a young man and his girlfriend arrived. They both appeared to be around 19 years old, a year or so younger than me. The young man resembled Jim Morrison, the singer of The Doors who had passed away 3 years earlier. The young lady had long, straight hair and a slim build. Their names were Steve and Christine. They took off their jackets and Christine found a seat for her and Steve within the circle of chairs. Steve was very outgoing and charismatic, and instead of sitting down immediately with Christine, he instead walked around the room giving a special hello to each individual, either shaking their hand or giving them a hug. He obviously was well liked by the group and had an air of mischievousness and impishness about him. His behaviour reminded me of the character Alex in the movie Clockwork Orange. With a twinkle in his eye, a slightly raised eyebrow and a devilish smile, he fostered a feeling of recklessness. I had observed that as he interacted with each person, he made very strong eye contact, making the other person feel like they were the centre of his attention. He vaguely reminded me of a politician working a room. The difference being that Steve was just being very true to his character, and the way he treated people came from the heart. He was a charmer and had an obvious love of life. He slowly made his way around the room, and as he arrived in front of me, I could feel the eyes of the group watching. Steve asked me my name and then told me his. He was actually the first person in the house who introduced himself to me. He started to lean forward while looking into my eyes, and I suddenly realized he was about to kiss me. I very quickly went with the flow and we gave each other a momentary kiss on the lips. Steve then moved on to the next person as I sat back and looked around the room. Everyone seemed to relax and ease back in their chairs. I perceived that it had been some kind of test to see how I would react. Although I was not in the habit of kissing men on their lips, it didn't bother me, and in that room with those people, it seemed kind of natural, like it was no big deal. As the evening progressed, I began feeling rather drowsy and contemplated driving back to my rented room in Princeton. But I was exhausted, and it was a long drive down winding country roads with few streetlights, so I wasn't really keen on the idea. Fortunately, Maria came up to me and suggested that I spend the night in one of the cabins on the property, which were located about 30 yards from the main house. Each cabin had a couple of bedrooms with living room windows that were floor to ceiling, allowing one a view of the surrounding woods. There was a spotlight mounted on the outside wall above the window which illuminated the trees at night. Maria walked me out to one of the cabins where another friend of the family was staying temporarily. His name was Clark. As I entered the cabin, Clark was playing a Jimi Hendrix song on his electric guitar, which was plugged into a small amplifier. I also played guitar, so after meeting we took turns playing his guitar while getting to know each other. As the evening matured, I ran out of energy and ended up crashing in one of the bedrooms. When I awoke the next morning, the sun was out. It was a beautiful day, and after splashing some cold water on my face, Clark and I smoked a couple of joints and resumed taking turns playing his guitar. Later that morning, I walked up to the main house and spoke to Maria about my plans to head home. She told me that I should stay and that I was more than welcome to spend another week visiting her and her family. Maria's father, Nathaniel, was a local dream psychologist and Gestalt therapist who lived at Alpha Farm with his wife and 9 kids. Maria, Denny, Tim, Harry and Kelly were his children from a previous marriage. Maria and Denny were a little younger than me. His new wife Hope had previously been married to a famous American author, and she brought her 4 daughters, Jamie, Martha, Savannah and Lorena, to the mix. There was a pond on the property surrounded by a cedar forest, and approximately half of the 50 acres was cleared land. The property covered the top of the hill. The original structure had been a hunting cabin, and after Nathaniel purchased the property, he hired a group of Irish carpenters who basically resembled the 7 dwarfs to customize the house. One major project they did was build out the living room to create a large dining room. With this extension, the house resembled a Y shape, with the bottom of the Y being the new dining room. It had a long wooden dining room table capable of seating over 16 people. At the far end of the table was the rear wall that had stained glass windows from the floor to the peaked ceiling, which provided a spectacular view of the valley below. The parents' master bedroom was at one end of the house. Located at the other end of the house was an indoor heated swimming pool with Japanese-style sliding shoji paper doors. There were no lights in the pool room other than numerous candles and candelabras scattered about. Each of the children's bedrooms, which were located in both sections of the house, had a round opening cut into the ceiling with a ladder that led to a private loft for each room. The family kept horses, sheep, and chickens on their ranch. After spending a week hanging out in one of the cabins, Denny, Maria, Nathaniel, and I were driving around in his Cadillac one morning when Nathaniel mentioned that he was looking to hire someone to be a driver for the family. I told him I had lots of driving experience and would love to take the job. He cautioned me that one caveat would be that I would have to live in one of the cabins on the property during my employment. I considered that to be a job perk, not an inconvenient requirement. I quickly told him again I would love to take the job. Later that day, I drove back to my apartment in Princeton, told my friends I was moving out, and returned to the farm with all my belongings, which fit into a small box. During my first week staying at Alpha Farm, just prior to moving in permanently, I had seen a young man around my age sitting outside one of the 2 cabins on the property. His name was Randy, and he had long blonde hair past his shoulders, a clean-shaven classic European face, and was dressed in leather pants and a t-shirt. He had a very laid-back demeanour. Randy and Clark had apparently known each other since they were young kids and were both long-time friends of the family at Alpha Farm. Randy and I hit it off right away, and within a short time it felt like we were old friends. Randy did not live at the farm, but he was a frequent visitor. During the 7 months I lived on the farm, Randy would frequently stop by and hang out. We were very comfortable with each other, never argued, and had a lot in common in our approaches to life. My main job at the property was to be the family chauffeur, driving the parents to the airport, the kids to school, and anywhere else anyone wanted to go. I was also given various tasks like feeding the livestock and other duties. One of my duties was rolling joints out of bags of Colombian pot for Nathaniel. The weed was very seedy, and every time I rolled up a few ounces, I would save the seeds in glass mason jars that Nathaniel provided me. He had already built up a collection of a few mason jars stuffed with pot seeds. One day, Nathaniel called me into his office and said that he wanted me to grow a field of marijuana in the cedar tree clearing on his property. By that time, I had added a couple of jars' worth of seeds to his collection, so I would have no problem carrying out his wishes. Coincidentally, the clearing had been created a couple of years prior when James B., a friend of the family, had harvested some cedar trees on the property and turned them into poles for a teepee he was building. To this day, I still garden, and although I now live in a 3rd-story apartment, I grow many vegetables, fruits, and herbs on my balcony. To this day, I still garden, and although I now live in a third-story apartment, I grow many vegetables, fruits and herbs on my balcony. The next morning, I grabbed a pick, shovel and wheelbarrow and made my way down the meandering path that led to the cedar forest clearing, which was roughly circular in shape with a 60-foot diameter. The clearing was surrounded by a small forest of cedar trees, 40 feet tall. The soil was very fertile and easy to break up with the pick. By the time I was done many hours later, I had a 1.5 foot deep layer of tilled soil. Since the family kept sheep, horses and chickens on their property, I gathered manure from all 3 animal pens and moved approximately 20 full wheelbarrows of the fertile droppings down to the cedar clearing. Altogether, I added about a 6-inch deep layer of poop all across the tilled soil. I then spent another whole day using the shovel to mix the forest soil with the manure. I had spent over 2 full days preparing the soil for planting. The timing was perfect as it was late March and spring was shyly making its appearance. I took 2 pint-sized jars of the pot seeds and scattered the seeds all about the whole clearing. After raking the soil to cover the seeds, I ended my work for the day. In my opinion, the best way to start a plant is to grow it from seed in the location where it will grow to maturity. Some people like to start seeds in small pots or cups and then transplant the seedlings. That method does seem to ensure that you end up with a higher germination rate, but the plants are not as hardy as plants that grow from seed to a mature plant in one spot with no transplanting occurring. If I let all the young seedlings grow, I would end up with hundreds of thin, spindly plants, which was not my goal. After thinning the plants over a 2-week period, I ended up with 4 main plants in the center of the clearing, surrounded by approximately 25 to 30 smaller plants. During each morning after the seedlings appeared, I would sit cross-legged on the soil at the edge of the clearing, just as the sun was beginning to appear in the east. I would then talk to the seedlings and explain to them that once they had fully matured, they would be harvested and used to treat diseases. The plants would also assist humans in their endeavors to connect to the energies and spirits of our earth and all of its inhabitants. Years before I had read about Gustav Fechner, a German professor who in the mid-1800s suggested that plants could feel human emotions. I was also aware that some Native Americans would leave pinches of tobacco on the dead carcasses of animals they had hunted, believing that the tobacco could connect the animal to the spirit world. In 1973, a few months before I moved to Alpha Farm, a book was published titled The Secret Life of Plants by Christopher Bird and Peter Tompkins, and in 1979, Stevie Wonder released his album Journey Through the Secret Life of Plants. I have believed most of my life that plants respond to emotions, music, talking, and other sensory input that many mistakenly believe are only experienced by humans. Over the decades that I have gardened, I have observed the effects of talking to plants, and I have no doubt that music, good vibes, and a tranquil environment have a wonderful effect on the plant's health. At that time, I had shoulder-length hair and would usually walk around dressed in just blue jeans. No shoes, shirt, hat, or anything else, just jeans. I also had a foot-long double-edged throwing knife strapped to my waist and thigh in a sheath. I'm sure anyone seeing me in the field half-dressed with a knife on my hip might be a bit leery of approaching me. Appearances can be deceiving, as I was actually a fairly peaceful guy. As the weeks passed and the plants grew taller, I had to tilt my head back while sitting on the ground in order to see the tops of the plants as they reached for the heavens. The 4 main plants in the center of the clearing eventually reached a height of 14 eyes. The other 25 to 30 plants reaching heights between 5 and 6 inches. Besides this project, I still had my regular duties to perform for the family, so I kept busy during my days at the farm. One of the main vehicles I drove for Nathaniel was his late 60s turquoise Cadillac. Nathaniel had strong opinions about politics, and he despised Richard Nixon, who was the president at that time. Nathaniel had taken wide strips of duct tape and created large block letters spelling "Impeach Nixon" across the rear bumper of the Cadillac. On a few occasions, while driving for Nathaniel, I was pulled over by the police, who were offended by the message on the bumper. Fortunately, they never found the ever-present Ziploc bag of marijuana that I had with me. I would usually stuff the bag under the front seat if I was being pulled over. Following a stern lecture from the cops about the importance of showing respect for the president, they eventually let me go on my way. My days were filled with driving family members to wherever they chose to go, running errands, feeding the livestock, rolling hundreds of joints at a time for Nathaniel, growing a field of pot, hanging out in the cabin, and exploring the 50 acres of land that made up Alpha Farm. When I would visit the room at night, I would light numerous candles, lanterns, and candelabras, pipe in some music from the living room stereo, and float in the steamy water while looking out over the valley through the open shoji doors. If you looked towards the pool room at night from outdoors, the whole room glowed from the soft candle light. The pool was heated, which produced billowing clouds of steam. Sometimes I would partially slide open one of the shoji doors, and the steam would flow out into the evening sky. It was very sublime in the pool room at night. One afternoon, I had to find Nathaniel, as I was having some issues with a task I had been assigned. One of the family members told me he was in the pool room. As I entered through the sliding shoji door, I saw that Nathaniel was in the pool with approximately 40 middle-aged adults of both sexes who were taking part in a group therapy class he was holding. Everyone was naked, there was pot smoke in the air, and they had all formed a conga line in the water, with each person holding the shoulders of the person in front of them. No one seemed upset about my sudden appearance, and after I asked Nathaniel about a situation I was handling and received his advice, I made my exit. It was just another typical day at Alpha Farm. 11 months prior to moving onto the property, I had become a vegetarian. At that time, in early 1973, I had been hired by two businessmen who owned a small boutique shop in the new mini shopping centre located near Kendall Park, which was approximately 8 miles northeast of Princeton. My job was to operate a typical New York City rolling hot dog stand, which was stored at night in their boutique. During the day, I would wheel it out and set it up in front of their store, offering hot dogs for sale to shoppers passing by. January in New Jersey can be very, very cold. At times there can be blizzards, ice storms, snowstorms, and freezing rain. I had to bundle up to prevent my body from freezing while standing outside for 2 hours a day. Every time I would open the bins to make a hot dog for a customer, billowing clouds of steam would cover my upper body. At the end of the 2-hour shift, my winter jacket was coated with a fine layer of fat from the hot dog steam. There was this one young lady, around 18 years old, who would stop by my cart every day and order a hot dog bun with relish and mustard, but no hot dog. When I would hand her what she ordered, she would sit on the freezing curb and talk to me for a half-hour or so before leaving. One day, a friend of mine was observing our ritual, and after she left, he said, "Dude, that girl likes you." I was not convinced and questioned him as to how he reached that conclusion. He listed the reasons. It's freezing outside. She doesn't eat hot dogs and only eats the buns covered with relish and mustard. She sticks around for half an hour to an hour and talks to you while freezing. If she doesn't like you, then why is she doing this? Well, I had to capitulate, and I agreed that she probably liked me. So I started dating her and found out she was a vegetarian. A few months later, in April of '73, the businessman had been losing money on the hot dog stand and sold it. Fortunately, I was hired for a 2-week job by a printer who was running a one-man print shop outside of Newark, NJ. He needed help to print out thousands of donation brochures for the Easter Seals Foundation, a non-profit organization which helps the disabled. There was only one large printer in the shop, and I was quickly trained to operate it, feed it paper, and fix any jams as it cranked an endless stream of brochures. I was staying in a hotel during the 2 weeks, and at night I would go to the hotel's bar and order a submarine sandwich for dinner. I would usually call my girlfriend from a payphone during my evening meal. For some reason, she would always ask me what I was eating, so that night I told her I was having a roast beef sandwich. It just happened to be my 21st birthday, and as a gift to myself I decided I would become a vegetarian. So when I first moved on to Alpha Farm in January of 1974, I had been a vegetarian for approximately 9 months. One day Nathaniel told me he had an errand for me to run. He wanted me to load up 2 of his sheep and drive them to the local butcher shop. I asked him what was going on as I started to have suspicions about what he had in mind. He said the owner of the shop would butcher the 2 sheep, and then I would have to drive back there and pick up the large boxes of meat and bring them back to the house. I couldn't believe it. They wanted to kill the totally cool sheep that had lived so peacefully on their property. I could not dissuade Nathaniel from this decision, so I drove the sheep there, said my goodbyes, and headed back to the farm. One of my jobs at the property was feeding the animals, so over time I had bonded with the sheep and enjoyed seeing them every day. A few days later, when I picked up the boxes of meat, I noticed that the bloody sheepskins were in a corner of the shop. I asked the butcher if I could have them, and he said no problem. There was a very long, curved, half-mile-long driveway that accessed Alpha Farm. Once you reached the top of the driveway, you had a clear view of a large building on the left, similar to a shed or barn. Once you reached the top of the driveway, you had a clear view of a large building on the left, similar to a shed or barn. There was no way for visitors or residents to avoid seeing those bloody sheepskins I had nailed up in protest to the killing of the sheep. Nathaniel never said a word to me about it, too. Nathaniel never said a word to me about it and allowed my silent protest to stay. Nathaniel, being a Gestalt therapist, was always very tolerant of behavior that normally would have caused me problems. I've always believed that one of the tenets of Gestalt therapy is to not hold in strong feelings. That you need to let it out. Life at the farm was very much in the open. There were at least a few times that actions by me would barely cause a raised eyebrow, which in other company might cause an uproar. The family had visitors coming and going at all times. One early summer day, a local band that played Grateful Dead music came by to visit the family. Bugsy was the singer of the band, and although he mainly focused on Grateful Dead songs, he could also belt out some kick-ass blues. During one of their visits, the band members, Denny, Randy, and some of the older kids and I were sitting around the long handmade wooden dining room table. As we sat there, things were rather calm, and we were all waiting for something to occur to break up the monotony. Nathaniel suddenly appeared in the room and suggested that we film a homemade movie. Ideas were thrown about, and it was decided we would make a science fiction movie about people sliding off the edge of the Earth into space. So we headed down to the basement to find costumes to wear for the movie. The main house had an extensive basement with a seemingly endless stretch of connected rooms. Some of the rooms had large piles of mattresses and blankets, others household objects and furniture, while the room we were heading for was filled with clothing and costumes from many eras. After rooting around in the large piles of clothing, we all found something interesting to wear. An observer looking at us would have marveled at how many different time periods were represented by our choice of costumes. When we emerged from the basement, we found Nathaniel sitting at the dining room table. He had a 2-gallon jar sitting on the table in front of him that was filled with honey and mushrooms. He then suggested that we all eat some magic mushrooms to help guide us in our movie project. Well, you don't have to ask this group twice. Nathaniel walked around the room spoon, feeding each of us a dose of the mushrooms covered in honey. He had put on a large sheepskin vest, accompanied by a 10-gallon cowboy hat, which actually holds less than a gallon of water. Although Nathaniel was always clean-shaven, he had applied a thick layer of what appeared to be either shaving cream or whipped cream to the lower half of his face. He looked like a rabid, deranged cowboy. Coincidentally, the role Brando played in the Missouri Breaks showcased Brando as a rabid, deranged bounty hunter. At one point, Brando hunts down some rustlers and kills them all while dressed as an old lady. Within a short period of time, the mushrooms began to affect our vision, thoughts, and feelings, and gave our creativity a definite twist. We decided that the Earth had suffered some kind of catastrophic event, and as the Earth tilted, we all were sliding off of it into space. Of course, this defies all logic and knowledge of physics, but what the hell? We can always blame the mushrooms. The rest of the film is a garbled and foggy memory to me. I do recall that hours later, we all ended up back at the dining room table. At first, we just sat there and vibrated with blank stares on our faces while pulsing to the energy coursing through our veins and into our brains. Then, one of the band members began slowly playing the top of the dining room table as if it was a conga drum. We all began to add our own beats and patterns to the drumming, and within minutes we had essentially reenacted the song Soul Sacrifice that Santana performed at Woodstock in 1969. The dining room table was practically bouncing up into the air from our frantic pounding. We were also yelling in unison the chant from Soul Sacrifice. Whoa, 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 whoa. Hey, 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 hey. We could have raised the dead with our efforts. We all morphed into a throbbing, pulsating, pounding organism, expressing life in its finest and rawest nature. Eventually, as our energy petered out like a bright bulb slowly dimming, the drumming became softer and slower. With a deep group sigh, the music came to a tranquil end as the vibrations of the final note drifted away. We sat there numb and satisfied. The silence was astounding, just as powerful as the drumming and chanting had been. But we were not done yet, not by a long shot. Bugsy, who like the rest of us appeared to be in a trance, suddenly burst forth with a soulful bluesy song with simple lyrics, heartfelt singing like I've never heard before. I could barely breathe as his magnificent voice nourished my soul with its raw honesty and feelings. I can honestly say after all these years that I've never heard a blues song that affected me more. Some would suggest that my judgment was affected by the mushrooms. I was definitely affected by the mushrooms, but if Bugsy had not been an excellent singer, the mushrooms would have just amplified his shortcomings. It was quite the opposite. His singing was reminiscent of Alex in the movie A Clockwork Orange when he described a singer performing a Beethoven song. Oh, bliss, bliss and heaven. Oh, it was gorgeousness and gorgeosity made flesh. And then a bird of rarest spun heaven metal, or like silvery wine flowing in a spaceship. Gravity all nonsense now. I knew such lovely pictures. Life was very enjoyable living at Alpha Farm. There were times when I could scarcely believe my good luck in ending up there. However, there was one issue which eventually festered to the point where it caused me to leave the farm. Nathaniel's wife Hope was not the hippie adventurer that her husband was. She was the more conservative of the two, and at times she would get upset with some of the behavior that she witnessed at the farm. I drew her attention when I began inviting some of my friends to visit me at the cabin. One of them she found to be very undesirable. The tension started building between Hope and me around the 6th month that I was living there. She tried to ban my friend from visiting, but Nathaniel decided that I could have anyone I wanted to come and visit me as long as they stayed in my cabin. I liked Hope. I was impressed by her devotion to her children and Nathaniel after enduring her previous divorce. She was a strong woman, creative, and despite her objections to my living at the property, I had no ill feelings towards her. I was more disappointed than anything else that I had not been able to turn things around and change her opinion of me. At one point, Hope gave Nathaniel an ultimatum that either I move off of the property or she was going to move out. Nathaniel told her that he would not change his mind and was sorry she felt that way. Although Nathaniel was an early feminist and had helped organize the Princeton chapter of the National Organization for Women in 1970, he still had times when he felt the man in the marriage should be in charge. Hope ended up moving out of the house the next day, and Nathaniel fell into a state of depression. Nathaniel spent much of the next 3 days lying in his bedroom staring at the ceiling. I approached him and offered to move off the property. He refused to accept my offer and said that with time, Hope would come back to him. Regardless, it broke my heart to see how despondent he had become. I had no desire to drive these two people apart. In my heart, love comes first before all else. How dare I even consider staying if it separates two people who obviously love and care for each other? The thought of being forced to move out of the house was not pleasant, but during my upbringing, I had lived in 5 states and numerous homes by the time I was 6 years old. From the age of 18 to 22, I had lived in various houses, apartments, a lean-to, a commune, a tent in the woods, and spent nights crashing in dormitories at Princeton University and couches in the homes of friends who lived with their parents. When moving to a new place to live, I always saw it as a chance to renew, to make new friends, see new sights, and experience new adventures. So in June of 1974, I told Nathaniel how much I appreciated his efforts to help me, but I also respected the sanctity of his marriage to Hope. I told him that I could see he was distraught, and if my being there was causing issues between him and his wife, then it was time for me to go. I thanked him for inviting me into his family, allowing me to live at his property, and providing numerous adventures and good times while living at the farm. It was time to move on. Just like a stream when water stops flowing, it stagnates. Moving on would mimic a rushing mountain stream, full of life and vigor. I had spent a lot of time growing the field of pot for Nathaniel. I worked on that plot every day for 2.5 months. I decided I would come back to the property with 6 of my friends and take 15 of the plants and leave the rest. I was giving up my life there, and I felt like I deserved to have half of the weed. When my friends and I arrived at Alpha Farm, we walked out to the pot field. After cutting down half of the plants, each of us carried a bundle of 2 plants resting on our shoulders. We then formed a single file line and slowly trudged out of the woods. We were a motley group, long hair, hippie clothes, and a scruffy look, with our young, thin beards and moustaches. From a distance, I imagine that we looked like woodsmen, returning with our freshly cut trees, as we made our way back to the main house. 4 of us were each carrying one of the 4 14T plants, which extended way behind our backs as we trudged along with the plants resting on our shoulders. Although I felt that I had the right to take half the plants, I still have some regrets about that decision as I look back on those days with a new perspective.